In this Lords of the Fallen video, I'm going to be talking about our gameplay impressions from the full version of the game, as well as give you guys some updates on the way certain mechanics in the game work. If you wanted some more details on how the game plays, how's it different from Souls, what are things that you might not know about, we're going to go through these in this video. So I played about 30 hours of the game or so up through the 4th boss, and we weren't allowed to go past this for our preview impressions, so I'm not going to talk about anything past that. However, I did play this stretch of the game, which is a rather large stretch of the game. I imagine it would probably take a normal person about 10 to 12 hours to do one blind playthrough through that much of the game. And we did play with different play styles. I played with dual wield, sword and shield, magic, not magic. So I want to talk about different play styles as well as kind of like how the game plays for that first chunk. And the first thing I want to talk about when you're immediately going to notice when you're playing Lords of the Fallen is that it has much less of a reliance on blocking than Souls games do. Shields in the beginning part of the game don't have a lot of physical protection, usually somewhere between 30 to 40% when you block, which means you are going to take some damage when you block, basically every time. But they made it a little bit more forgiving because essentially what happens when you block now is you have a wither mechanic that makes your health kind of like grayed out, and then if you hit enemies, you can regain that before they hit you again. Kind of like Lies of P, if you're familiar with that. Very similar mechanic when you block in that game. If you attack afterward without getting hit, you'll be able to regain some of your health. That happens in this game as well on block. So unless you're, very good at getting your health back without getting hit, you're not going to be blocking as much. You're going to be relying more on dodge rolling, and parrying. And the game has two different dodges. It has a dodge and a dodge roll. Tapping dodge once does kind of like a sidestep, and tapping it twice does a dodge roll if you need to roll further or to extend your dodge. And parrying works, similar to the Souls games where if you tap it at the right time, you do some posture damage to the enemy. It doesn't always guard break them like it would in Dark Souls or something like that. But you do some posture damage, particularly to like harder to kill enemies. If you parry them a couple times, you can usually stagger them. And enemies have like a posture mechanic, not unlike Sekiro, where if you deal enough damage to them or if you parry enough of their attacks, they kind of get staggered if you do like a kick or a heavy attack, and then you can do like a devastating attack on them. And another thing that I want to mention is that weapon movesets seem extremely varied in this game, and you have tons of different inputs. You can hit different buttons at the same time to do different attacks. You do spinning attacks, running attacks, rolling attacks. There are so many different attacks in this game with each weapon type that it's incredible, in my opinion. I was not expecting so many different attacks with each type of weapon, and I think it's something that players are going to be impressed with immediately, coming from games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls. There is even more inputs that they can do in this game to get more attacks out of their weapon types. And there are also 3 different types of magic in the game. You have Umbral, Inferno, and Radiant. Radiant are kind of like your miracles. Inferno is kind of like your pyromancy / sorceries. And then you have Umbral, which is kind of like your dark magic. Umbral requires a catalyst that uses both Inferno and Radiant stats. Inferno requires Inferno. Radiant requires Radiant. And these spells can be mapped to different buttons. So unlike Souls, where you have to cycle through the spells you want as you're fighting, in this game you can have up to 3 or 4 spells slotted into your catalyst, and then you'll hold left trigger and press whatever button it is to cast that spell, so you can cast different spells without having to cycle, which is really nice. And just like the Souls games as well, there are different catalysts that are better or worse that are available for each type of magic, and you'll find them throughout your playthrough. You can upgrade them so they have better scaling, etc. And your character progression works very similarly to the way it does in the Souls games, where you gain currency called Vigor from enemies as you defeat them, and then you use that to buy items in the game, or you use it to increase your attributes at Vestiges, which are like the bonfires of the game. And you can also upgrade your weapons and armor at the blacksmith in order to make them stronger, or your catalyst. And you'll find rings and amulets as well. There are 2 ring slots and an amulet slot in the game, so you can slot those to make your character more powerful. And there's also equip load in the game, so your rolling is going to be based on whether you're light, medium, or heavy. Heavy, obviously, fat rolling, light having better dodges. So you're going to manage your equipment through this. There's a little bar on the screen you can see that kind of shows you what that looks like. And there aren't separate weapon sets in the game. Like, you don't have multiple weapons equipped at the same time. So you just have one weapon set and usually your catalyst. And that's like your weight. And then if you want to change, you switch your weapons, etc. And you can dual wield in the game too, which is great. And the general gameplay loop is very similar to Souls in that you have an area to explore, like a world area. And there's different ways to go within that area, and they're all kind of interconnected to different areas. If you go left, maybe that connects to a new area. And if you go right, maybe that connects to a new area, but at some point they might come back together in a different area, etc. It's very interconnected, the game, which is fantastic. And exploration in Lords of the Fallen is easily my favorite part of the game. There is stuff hidden everywhere in this game. The level design is incredible. The shortcuts are very well done. And they have a mechanic in this game that I talked a little bit about in the previous video that allows you to jump back and forth between like the Umbral Realm and your realm. So what happens is as you're exploring, eventually you'll need to shift into the Umbral Realm because you'll come to like a dead end, can't figure out where to go. You'll shift into the Umbral Realm and then everything will change and you'll find ways to go that you couldn't before. You'll find new loot hidden in different places, etc. And the Umbral Realm is much more unforgiving than the regular realm. As you're in there, more and more enemies will start coming after you, and eventually if you're in there for too long, some very, very powerful enemies will come after you and you will probably die. So you can only stay there for a limited time and you're going to be shifting back and forth in order to not only keep exploring and find things you might have missed, because you don't always have to shift to the Umbral Realm, but sometimes you'll want to shift to see if there are things that you might find, like loot or new weapons, armor, spells, etc., that you'll miss out on if you don't. But there's a lot of pressure on you to keep shifting because you want to shift for exploration, and in some places you will indeed need to, but also you need to shift back periodically or you're going to get killed by some very powerful enemies. So you're constantly jumping back and forth between these realms, and when I first played the game, you know, I wasn't sure how much of an impact this would have on the game and whether it'd be a gimmick or not, and I can confidently say at this point, absolutely phenomenal. The way it's designed is incredible. It makes exploration even more interesting because it adds a layer of dimension on top of what you're already exploring. And it's actually quite ingenious that they've been able to do this because they've basically stacked the world on top of a world. They've designed two worlds within one, and it's very, very well done. And the different zones of the game are very well done too. The different environments that you go through. You have like villages and castles and caves and platforms, and each area feels very distinct. There are other areas of the game that I don't want to talk about. I don't want to spoil for players. But there are a lot of different environments in this game. They all feel very different. The enemies feel different. It is a very good job they did here in this regard, and it helps add to that aspect of exploration that I think is arguably the best part of the game. And while you're out exploring, you're going to find vestiges which work like bonfires, and each one of these is a remnant of a previous lamp bearer, which is what you are in the game. You're a lamp bearer, you know, using the lamp to bridge the gap between worlds. And each one of these lamp bearers has their own lore and history throughout the game, so you're kind of following in the footsteps of these lamp bearers as you move through the game, which is a nice touch in my opinion. And, you know, at these vestiges, you can rest to get your heals back, and you can upgrade your character if you want to spend your vigor to, you know, make your character stronger if you have enough, etc. And you can fast travel between these points as well. And something really cool that they've done is they've made these areas of the game where you can use an item called a vestige seed to create a vestige that you can rest at. And there's these places all over the game world, but you only have a limited number of vestige seeds. You can get some of them, by the way, from co-oping. If you're helping people co-op, you'll be able to get more. But initially, without that, you're going to have a very limited amount. So you have to pick and choose, where do you want to put your vestiges? Do you need to rest at this spot? Do you need to create a save spot? How far is it from here to the next spot? These are decisions you have to make, and you often have to make them when you're playing without knowing how far it is to the next zone. So they're incredibly tough decisions to make, and it adds a little bit of tension to the game that I really like. And the boss fights of the game so far have been interesting. They've all been different. They've been interesting mechanics. They've been challenging, but not super challenging. I think most players would say that they're probably not as difficult as the Souls games so far, although I think the difficulty of each boss varies a bit. Some have been easier, some have been harder, so it's going to be hard to say like whether it all pans out to be on the same level as Souls, but I think it's in the ballpark so far, and I don't think most bosses are a cakewalk or anything like that, but I don't think, you know, a lot of Souls veterans are going to have a ton of trouble with them either. And as always, if you do have trouble with these, you can summon NPCs for a lot of these boss fights to help you. These are characters that are in the game, and actually as you find more and more NPCs, more and more of them can help you from different fights, which is kind of cool. Or you can summon another player to help you as well. If you're co-oping already, they can just come into the boss with you. Or, you know, if you want to summon them for that fight, you can. And the NPCs of the game have their own stories and quests. Many of these are very cryptic. You don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes they ask you to give them an item. You don't know what you get in exchange for it. And sometimes you don't get anything. Then maybe you get something later on. And they've done this very similarly to the Souls games. There is a place in the game called Skyrest Bridge, which you'll get to pretty early on. It's kind of like the Firelink Shrine of the game, if you will, where all the NPCs gather. If you find NPCs, rescue them, or help them, etc. out on the landscape, they usually gather there. Not always, but they usually do. And they've done these fairly well, in my opinion. The voice acting on them is usually good. There are some characters that I feel like their voice just does not match the character at all, or doesn't match the game at all. But for the most part, they're very, very well done. And they help to create that lore and setting of the game that really pulls you in. And if it wasn't obvious from the gameplay footage, the main enemy of the game is the Rogar, which make up Return from the previous Lords of the Fallen game. That was the main enemy type in that game, if you remember. But there are other enemies you will fight as well. They are not all Rokar. And there are sort of these factions within the game that, you know, you kind of run into that are sort of vying with each other and have their different philosophies. So you'll see that a lot throughout the course of the game. And I also want to talk a bit about the performance of the game. I know a lot of people are interested in how games are playing, particularly ones that, you know, look as good as this one. And I've been playing on a 3080 Ti with a pretty good system, and I've been playing at 1440p on high pretty much exclusively, playing in full screen. The game seems to perform much better in full screen than windowed borderless for some reason, so if you are playing the upcoming launch, make sure you put it in full screen. But I'm getting somewhere around 100 to 150 FPS. It's kind of fluctuating in that range on those settings, which is generally pretty good. And I have had a few stutters at the beginning of the game, nothing seriously major, mostly pretty smooth performance across the board. There are a couple places where it dips. But I will say the further and further you get into the game, it seems like the performance issues start to ramp up. And one of the things that's kind of strange is that, like, if you play the game for a long session and then you restart the game, you seem to get better performance. So I don't know if there's some sort of memory leak or what's going on. I am not a technical person when it comes to this sort of thing. But it's easily fixed a lot of the time by just restarting the game. And it hasn't been all that often, just very particular spots in the game. So there are some performance issues, but they are not major. And when it comes to crashes, I've had one in 30, 40 hours, something like that. Very, very few at all. The game is very stable. When it comes to bugs, most of the bugs are minor, like getting summoned with not all my health or mana, or clicking on a menu and it doesn't do anything, but then the next time I click it, it works. Or, you know, something's just not working right. You reload the game, it's working fine. Nothing game-breaking, nothing that was like really jarring or anything like that. Just a couple things that usually restarting the game would fix. So I do think the game is going to have some bugs at launch. It might have some performance issues. They have been patching the game as we've been playing, so every build and every day the build is a bit different, so I'm not exactly sure what it's going to look like when it's finalized. I'm hoping most of these will be fixed at launch. The game's not in a very bad state as it is generally. I think most people will find it acceptable, although probably not ideal in a lot of cases, but I am confident that this will get better over time. So all in all, I'm even more excited. I was super excited for this game after Gamescom. Now having played even more, getting to understand the game systems a bit more and seeing the world and the development of it, I cannot wait to play more of this game. We're going to be playing it over the next week or so, getting stuff ready for launch of the game with guides and the wiki and everything and all that. And I'll just say this, if you are a Souls fan, you're going to want to play the new Lords of the Fallen game. You're just going to want to play it. It has all the things that I've seen so far that make Souls what it is. It has the feeling, it has the discovery, it has the combat, it has the customization, it has all the things that we've all come to know and love from the Souls games in it. And unless there's some drastic departure in later parts of the game from that formula, I think it's going to become a big hit. So what do you guys think from seeing all the footage that's released today? I know a lot of other content creators got to publish some footage and they've been playing as well. Having watched that, having watched this, what do you guys think of the game so far? Are you more excited? Are you fairly confident it's going to be good now? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below.